Next session, quite anticipated, we're heading into the world of public policy, perhaps where behavioral science maybe had its first real chance to run. And we're delighted to begin with one of the pioneers in the field, Michael Hallsworth. You'll hear more about Michael at the beginning of the discussion. And Eric, over to you.
Yeah, I am very happy also to conduct this interview with my friend and colleague, Edouard Le Serre. Edouard is the Deputy General Manager of the BVA family and one of the European leading voice regarding the analysis of public opinion and also the political world in general. So let's listen to Edouard and Michael Alsworth.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, now it's time for a very exciting session about the promise of and challenges facing behavioral science in public policy. Soon I will pass the questioning to my friend and colleague Edouard Le Serre. Edouard is the Deputy General Manager of the BVA family, CEO of the BVA House, and one of the best, I can tell you, European expert in public opinion and policy, with a special focus in the preparation of public policies, their optimization, their communication, and the evaluation of their impact. But first, we are very proud to introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Michael Alsworth. Michael is the Managing Director Americas of the Behavioral Insights team, also known as the BIT. Michael is a leading figure in the application of behavioral science to government and public policy. He is the author of several influential frameworks, one which has had a big influence on myself, Mindspace, and his work has been published in many leading economics and public policy journals. Prior to joining the BIT, Michael was a senior policy advisor in the Cabinet Office of the UK government, and prior to that, he earned his PhD in behavioral economics from Imperial College in London. Michael also is the co-author with Elizabeth Kirkman of a book entitled Behavioral Insight. I think it was published in 2021, which I am sure we will be speaking about today. So welcome, Michael. A big thank you to you for being with us. We are very excited to have a conversation for this opening session of our public policy roundtable. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to you, particularly before such a distinguished panel that you've got later.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Michael. It's really great to have you here. And maybe let's just jump into the questions we would like to ask you. We are now in 2022, nearly 15 years since the publication of Nudge. There are now more than 200 public organizations in the world applying behavioral science to improve public policy in governments such as UK, US, Singapore, Canada, etc. Also, the biggest, the most innovative private companies in the tech world, for instance, the Googles, Facebook, Microsoft, or in more traditional sector, now have chief behavioral science officer. So, in one word, how do you explain the amazing evolution in the application of behavioral science? And what would be for you the main factor of success, of that huge success?
Okay, sure. So one word is challenging. Maybe I'll come to the word at the end. But I think one fundamental reason is that people are interested in what drives human behavior. And behavioral science in its current kind of application, the current wave, gave an account of human behavior that was based on evidence, but also was engaging and simplified enough to resonate with people. I think people were interested in, if you like, the stories people could tell about here is a particular concept or idea, and here's how it plays out in practice, and this is how it drives behavior. There were a series of experiments that made it really come to life for people. I think that's the initial kind of interest, but of course that alone is not enough to translate into practice. I think a second reason is the commitment to evaluation that came alongside implementing these ideas in practice. The fact that you could then say this was the result of making this particular change, present that to your audience. You know, in the public sector, that's really quite compelling, particularly if you're trying to be evidence-based. You know, public money is on the line, results matter. So I think that was really powerful, and also it meant that people applying behavioral science in practice could also be advancing the field and showing how it plays out in different contexts and at different times. And that kind of gave it some momentum, I think. And the final thing I would highlight is, you know, that practical focus. It's not, you know, certainly speaking from BIT's perspective, the end goal was not necessarily an academic one. That was it was good if we could contribute to the academic literature. We really cared about changing things in the real world, and I think that speaks the language of people who are dealing with important concepts, different markets, and trying to achieve their strategic goals. So that's my summary, I think, of those three reasons: the stories, the evaluation, and the practical focus.
No, that's really clear. Thank you. You just mentioned public services as one of the levers that allowed the development of behavioral science and spreading of behavioral science everywhere. But more specifically, in which area and for which topic do you see the most impact of this adoption of applied behavioral science and not theory?
Two things come to mind. One is perhaps unsurprising. It's climate-related behaviours. You know, there are debates about this, but some people say that, you know, around 2/3 of changes required to reduce emissions will involve changes to human behaviour. Seems clear that is a really important part of the picture. And I think the challenge there is both a political one to work out which changes are you going to target and how are they acceptable, or how could you shift to public opinion so they are acceptable. And then the second is technically, how would they happen? How do you help people make changes that have a meaningful impact on the climate? So I think that's one that, you know, is perhaps obvious, and is a major policy issue, but remains true. The second idea is more like a way of approaching issues, and that's to focus on administrative burdens or sludge. I really do think this is very important for the public sector, for public policy. I myself, over time, have seen multiple instances where perhaps unintentionally services are being designed in the public sector that are just really difficult to navigate. And I think that behavioral scientists can sit alongside and work with designers, human-centered designers, and the people who really understand the policy goal to make real improvements there. And I think we're only just getting started. I think we don't really have even the methodology of how really to do that sorted. So that's quite exciting in my mind.
Well, thank you. It is actually. Just coming back, you are still really young, but you already have a long career in implementing behavioral science. What would be, if you had to tell about one, what would be the mission or the missions that you are most proud of? And maybe on the other side, maybe there's one mission that you really regret not to have been able to implement. What would they be?
As I rapidly approach 40, I sometimes don't feel so young, but thank you for that. Yeah. So I think one that comes to mind is work on antimicrobial resistance. And that, I think, is important because one, it's a really big, tough collective action problem. If antibiotics stop working, at some point we're going to have a terrible situation. But in the immediate term, it's really hard to perhaps shift behavior because for each individual person there may be benefits to getting antibiotics, or at least perceived benefits. So we did some work with Public Health England, which looked at social norms and reducing unnecessary antibiotic prescribing. And what's really interesting about that is that it has been copied or replicated or adapted in many different countries now around the world. And it has shown results in many different settings, and indeed over time as well, repeated usage. And I think that's really also interesting because it's been incorporated into a wider strategy for reducing antimicrobial resistance. It's not a solution on its own. Nobody thought it was, but as part of the package, I think it can make a contribution, and it's low cost, and it's a good instance of how you can make a difference with behavioral science, I think. In terms of regret, well, I think one thing that I have always been really interested in is how we can apply behavioral science to the way government works itself, to the policymaking process. We did this report 4 years ago called Behavioral Government, which tries to set out all the different ways that these insights are relevant. And my regret is that we just haven't done so much in this field, partly because people haven't really asked us, but it's hard to get governments interested in it. And that's surprising to a certain extent, because you would think that they were interested in improving performance. But on the other hand, it's not that surprising because a lot of the focus has been on achieving policy goals out there, and it's harder and more awkward in some ways to turn that back on yourself. Sometimes that client isn't there. So that's my regret, I think. I'd have liked to do more there.
Okay, thank you. Well, you allow me to jump to the next question. We've been talking a little bit about the past, about your experience, about the development of behavioral science. From your point of view, based on your experience, and because you are an important thinker in the domain, what is your view on the perspectives for behavioral science implementation? What are we going to see and see happen in the coming years from your point of view?
So, it's something I'm really interested in, actually. I've been working on this program of work for the last year and a half about the future of behavioral science. Really trying to look very, very hard at the criticisms that have come up. Behavioral science, take them seriously as we do, and try to build something better. So, I've been working on 10 proposals for how we can do that. Some of them talk about how we can try to tackle bigger policy issues by thinking about complex adaptive systems and improving behavioral science by getting more dynamic understanding of behavior in context, how people react to other people, how systems and markets change. And I think complexity thinking is a way of doing that. I'm thinking about how you might use RCTs better to actually reflect that adaptation. I think we need to think more about how we can decent the use of behavioral science and enable people to use the techniques themselves. That has always been a strand in applied behavioral science, but I think we could do more, and we've got to a stage where we know more about how we can do that. I think we need to get better at doing things like predicting the results of experiments and then feeding back the results to behavioral scientists to reduce overconfidence, to show that, to get better at predicting. Because sometimes I think we do experiments, we get results, and we kind of have hindsight bias, and we think, oh yeah, of course, yeah, that makes sense. I kind of knew that. It's not that surprising. But actually it may have been, but we forget how we felt beforehand. So these are some practical things I think you can do to improve the practice of behavioral science. But there are some bigger things as well, like I think we need to be more cautious about how we talk about findings. We know that there's a lot of heterogeneity in human behavior. Effects vary from settings to settings. So I think making really strong statements that social norms always have this effect, we really need to have moved away from that. And I won't go on, but there's also stuff around moving beyond like these lists of biases you see all the time. They're not doing the job. We need to have a better sense of theory at this kind of, something between system 1 and system 2 and lists of biases. There needs to be a connecting framework in the middle. But I won't go on too long about that. There'll be more on that soon.
No, thank you. You mentioned the criticism that sometimes and maybe more and more often emerge and come from different sides. We had during this summer a paper that was published around behavioral science and nudges. Are they really useful? Do they work? And you took part in the conversation, I would say, by publishing on your site an article around that. Could you, for our audience, just give a quick, summarize quickly what you wanted to claim and to say what's your point?
Yes, I'll try and do this quickly. So essentially, earlier this year, there was a meta-analysis of nudges, which said that overall they had a certain effect size, moderately large effect size. Then there was another meta-analysis which said, actually this analysis is affected by publication bias, and actually there is no effect of nudges if you correct for publication bias. Now, the first article had mentioned publication bias, but said it wasn't too bad. The second one went much further. Now, we know there is publication bias in the literature. That's definitely true, but it's not necessarily true that means there is no effect of nudges. I point out that there was a big study by Stefano Della Vigna and Elizabeth Linos that went through all the studies that BIT Americas and the Office of Evaluation Sciences did in the US. We allowed all our data to be analyzed from every trial we did. There was no publication bias in that, and the results show us the significant effect of these interventions. But moreover, I say that it doesn't really make much sense, first of all, to say things work or don't work, because we know there's a lot of heterogeneity in the results. And so the more important point is, when do things work or don't work, rather than just dismissing the whole field. And secondly, a lot of things will put into the bucket of the term nudges in that meta-analysis. And so nudges can be very helpful, but as many people have said, we've said them from the start, Laura on your panel often says, behavioral science is not just about nudges. So I feel that the debate was not very informative. And in fact, what we should be doing is understanding in what settings and what instances the use of behavioral science has effects more likely, and what size they're likely to be, than just saying it works, it doesn't work. That's a very basic debate I think we need to move beyond.
Okay, thank you. Coming back on where you're coming from. You're coming from the BIT in UK, and you've been now leading BIT Americas for some time. So you've been dealing with cultural differences, I guess, and more broadly, how generally do you deal with cultural differences from one country to another? Because BIT, you are everywhere. Well, your intervention are in many countries. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, maybe it's because when you're in a context, it's hard to sort of perceive it. But I don't see any massive differences between the UK and the US. I mean, they've often had a fairly shared research agenda, for example. I do think that the question of cultural differences, context is obviously so important. I think as behavioral scientists, we need to get better at judging how much an intervention's results were linked to its context, and therefore how much adaptation it may need to other situations. And there is some evidence that behavioral scientists can do this already. There's a paper by J. Van Bavel et al. From 2016, I think, where they took studies from the replication crisis, so replication studies, and they said for each of the ones featured, they asked people, how likely is it that you think this study will replicate elsewhere? And then they compared to see if their judgments were right and whether they could tell which ones did actually replicate when people did these big studies. And people are pretty good at assessing which studies would replicate in different contexts. So I think we need to really develop that skill at assessing it. And I think implementation science actually has done a lot of thinking on this already. And maybe as behavioral science, we don't interact with that quite as much. Some places do. I don't want to generalize. But I think in general, perhaps we don't. And the other side of that is that I think we need to codify and cultivate the practical skills that we successfully that successfully adapt interventions to new contexts. I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on behavioral science as if it's just about knowing things rather than knowing how to do things in particular contexts, that more practical skill. And I think a way to do this is understanding what people did to successfully adapt interventions. Quite often in academic articles, a lot of the stuff that would really help in that sense is actually cleared away as extraneous detail. I think we need to bring that back in rather than claiming universality for our results. We need to value those contextual details that may be crucial.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. Because they are increasingly adopted, the issue of ethics in nudge is so crucial, becomes even more crucial. What would be your recommendations to practitioners to really act and work in an ethical way when we are using behavioral science?
So I think that there are. This is becoming an increasingly important question, I think, because there's a lot of talk about using data science, machine learning to personalize interventions. Well, I think that very quickly runs into some ethical conundrums about to what extent should you tailor? Do people find that acceptable, particularly in online environments? Plenty of evidence that they don't, actually. So there's caution about sort of the headlong rush into really tailored precision nudging, potentially. In terms of practical recommendations, in our book, Alsworth and I talk about a really simple framework to do with assessing the level of transparency involved. So how could somebody know what the goal is of the intervention, for example, and what techniques are being used to achieve that goal? Is that discoverable in some way? And on the other hand, what level of control do people have to resist the intervention? And people often talk in terms of a ladder of increasing intensity of interventions. So first of all, you combine those two things into thinking about whether there's any manipulation involved. And then it's also worth bearing in mind the strength of people's preferences. If someone really, really wants to choose otherwise, that should be taken into account. And the extent of the consequences. Is there a much harm involved for the person if they, are you preventing a lot of harm for a person here? So the action to prevent that harm may be justified. And you can put those four things together to run through some of the ethical difficulties you may be facing. It's a very simple framework, but one I think has value.
Yeah, very powerful one. One last question. Eric, this one hasn't been prepared. One last question maybe. Is there one specific nudge that you use the most in your personal or professional life? Is there one that you would say, okay, maybe you forgot that you use it, but that maybe frame the way you act, you think, you work, you live? Is there one?
Something that I've always found quite helpful is the idea of the fundamental attribution error, so that the power of the situation is more than you might think. And I think that's helpful because it means it may pause your rush to judgment of others. Like you may assume that that's how someone is, but you should think about all the things that may be going on in their life, or the things they may be coming from in that moment, and the power of those factors. And I find that quite a helpful discipline sometimes to prevent a rush to judgment.
Yes, thanks a lot, Michael. I have a very final question for you before we start our roundtable on public policy. What would be your one piece of advice, if possible, for a leader in public policy who would like to start applying behavioral science in his or her organization?
Okay, so I think we're at a stage in behavioral science where you can say to somebody, don't push for results straight away. I know that's hard, but I think we may be in a stage where it's more about identifying the right opportunities, the context for decisions. We know that's really important. And also to say that there is luck involved. There's lots of luck involved. You may not get a direct hit the first time. I think part of the problem is that we go around as practitioners and tell stories about these successes. We downplay the multiple missteps and failed attempts and so on. And so people may have an unrealistic expectation about what they're going to get early on. So that's our responsibility as well. But I think we should be saying to people, you may not have a magic result straight away. And success may look a bit different from what you're expecting, having read, say, a popular book on the topic.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. I think it is a great advice, and it's been a real pleasure to have you opening our public policy session. A big thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And to our participants, stay tuned and logged in. We are now having an amazing roundtable about the promise and challenges for behavioral science in public policy. We just talked a lot about it, and it will be moderated by my colleague and BVA France co-director, Adelaide Zulfikar-Bassik. Thank you.
So, moving right along, because I see we're just on time. Eric, to you.
Maybe you remember at the beginning of this very insightful conversation with Michael Alsworth, he mentioned that we will have a wonderful round panel because of the quality of the panelists. And I do agree with Michael. So I would like to introduce our star practitioner in this area of public policy, Laura de Molière, who was the head of behavioral science at the UK Cabinet Office until last week. And everybody knows that UK has been and is still a pioneer in the application of behavioral science in public policy. Chiara Varazzani, who is the lead behavioral science at OECD, and also OECD is an amazing organization to infuse and to encourage the application of behavioral science for public good. And my friend Faisal Naru, who is a star and again a pioneer in the application of behavioral science in public policy, is now the executive director at the Policy Innovation Center in the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. So welcome to all.
And this roundtable will be moderated, as Edouard said, by Adelaide Zulfikar-Bassik, the co-director of the BVA France.
Again, please.
Adelaide
Zulfikar-Bassik.
And Adelaide's team works with many public actors, including the French government, a number of ministries, public institutions, And Adelaide and her great team accompany them on communication strategies and a number of different public policy issues. So Adelaide, take it away with our speakers. Good to see you guys online, and we'll speak to you after the break.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good morning to the three of you. It is an honor to be talking to you today. And let's jump straight in. And let's return to what Edouard Leclerc said at the very beginning of the conversation with Michael Hallsworth. He reminded us about the amazing evolution of behavioral science in public policy. It started 15 or 10 years ago, and today over 200 organizations have adopted it. Michael Alsworth has shared his point of view, and now I would like to hear yours. Why is it that behavioral sciences have become so prominent over the past 10 years? Let's start with you, Faisal, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel today. So why behavioral science and public policy? Well, I think there's a few reasons why. I think one of the reasons why around that time is that there was a search happening, particularly amongst many governments, around how they can certainly do things a lot better. Not least particularly in some countries where there was also an economic crisis. The financial crisis was happening at that time as well. So many governments were in the market for new ideas, and this new idea was coming to the fore at that particular time as well. And that new idea really was saying that we often do things without necessarily fully understanding or appreciating how people actually behave, as opposed to how we assume they behave. And so it was with that search for finding things that work better, finding that there is a better appreciation and understanding of human beings and their decision making that governments needed to start to pay attention to, meant that more governments started across the world, started to have a look at how they can start to apply nudging and behavioral science inside public policy. And it all came about, I think, in a very nice way, ultimately. And you can say that there were a number of early adopters across the world, not least the United States, United Kingdom, but many other places inside Europe, so Denmark and Ireland and a number of others. But then also it then started to appear in other parts of the world as well, like Singapore, South Africa, the Western Cape government. So it really spread around, and like you said, now it's proliferated across the world as a tool that governments and regulators and other public bodies need to have in order to do their jobs better and in order to have better public policy.
Yes, but how does it help to do their job better? How do you explain this amazing evolution?
Just very quickly, I think how it helps them is that it gives them a better understanding of how people will actually behave. And there are a few things that it does. Firstly, it really captures on a broad set of knowledge and literature that's out there from the cognitive and behavioral sciences and decision-making sciences. It introduced experimentation and testing inside governments, which was something that wasn't necessarily done. I mean, piloting was done, but testing and experimentation was a bit more rigorous. And it also started to test assumptions and introduce a different way of thinking inside governments.
Thank you, Faisal. How about you, Laura? How would you explain this amazing evolution?
So I'm going to also give you 3 reasons, 2 of which I think are really good reasons for why behavioral science got so prominent, and 1 of which I think is not such a great reason. So for me, the most important one and my favorite one is that behavioral science has surfaced new questions or introduced uncertainty around their answers. And those questions are, of course, around behavior, from to introducing questions about these behaviors, like what is the meaning for the population? And then, of course, significant questions around which concrete behaviors do you actually want to enable with your policy? And I think actually introducing these questions has made a real big difference, because now if behavioral science isn't involved in answering them, it almost feels like a real vacuum and an uncertainty for policymakers that they really should be doing that.
But excuse me, Laura, you mean that before that, these questions were never asked when you conduce public policy? It seems very strange.
So sometimes they were asked, but the uncertainty around the answer, which is something that Faisal just alluded to, which is around kind of how able are you actually going to predict these behaviors? I think that was a new importance. And the second bit, I think, that is really key here is that a lot of the times actually policy outcomes weren't translated in concrete behaviors. We see this all the time. Campaigns are run on awareness, and it's actually not really clear what precisely it is that we're trying to achieve. So that's exactly what I mean here. The second reason is, I think, a really important one that's underappreciated, although Michael just touched on this, which is that behavioral science brings a method and order when dealing with really complex questions in a chaotic and fast-moving world and under chaotic circumstances. As a policymaker, you are presented with often lots of pieces of evidence from anthropology, from sociology, from psychology, from economics, and so on. And actually making sense of how these pieces work together, what you use for your problem diagnosis, what you use for your design interventions, and what you use for evaluation, and kind of structuring these problems, I think led to policymakers to really appreciate the power of behavioral science.
What about the bad reason you mentioned?
The bad reason. So that is a personal bugbear of mine, is I think that behavioral science got really famous for being perceived as something that can provide quick and easy and cheap fixes, often in the absence of legislation, to address really complex problems. And for me, that's slightly negative, not because there aren't these unicorns, because that does actually work. And, we can send a text message and it helps us. And also not to say that a text message or a kind of tweaking communications won't be a really important part of a user journey and make a big impact. But to assume that behavioral science has that contribution to fix these complex problems is, I think, slightly misleading. And I think behavioral science has a lot more to offer.
Thank you, Laura. Chiara, would you agree with that? Do you think that people perceive behavioral science as providing quick fix to complex problems?
I totally agree, unfortunately, in the sense that I think that it's still the case. Things are improving, though. I think that more and more governments and policymakers now see behavioral science in a slightly different way, not as just nudging and easy fixes. But I'm happy to chat more about this, because I think that this is a real challenge for the future.
And about the reason that explains the amazing evolution, do we want to add something?
I think I totally agree with Faisal and Laura. To summarize, I think that behavioral science helped a lot of policymakers to get real. It's really kind of reality check in many different circumstances. So I think it summarizes well what Faisal and Laura were saying. There's only another couple of reasons, I think, that I'd like to mention. One is experimentation, as Faisal mentioned. That, like 10 years ago, I like to think that behavioral science is like a Trojan horse to get experimentation and real empirical evidence within governments, okay? And I still believe it's the case, but I think it worked in a way to a certain extent. And I think this was a great motivation for a lot of people, including me, to really step into behavioral science completely, because it was kind of a great opportunity and expedient, a Trojan horse, to get more evidence and experimentation in government. So that's one additional reason, maybe. And the other thing I wanted to mention is also that I think that we did a decent job at widening the policy areas. When you think at the very beginning, it was about compliance, taxation, and it was great, but areas that were very important for return on investment, for example. But I think that when you look at what people around the world are doing, people are using behavioral science in government to tackle climate change, misinformation, corruption, public sector integrity. These are wicked problems. And of course, we won't solve these only with behavioral science, but the fact that we are tackling them, it's a big win. And I think it served well the reputation of behavioral science.
Thank you, Chiara. And as you mentioned, the different issues and topics that you are tackling with behavioral science, I think it could be interesting to share with our audience concrete examples of what you do. So I would like to ask to each of you, and maybe start with you, Laura, what over your career is a key or an emblematic example of the use of behavioral sciences because of its efficiency or any other reason that you would like to mention?
Yeah, sure. I think picking one example as a behavioral scientist feels a little bit like deciding which child of yours you love the most. And I kind of really agree with Chiara that for me, the most rewarding pieces of work have been in this wicked space or in a space where behavioral science has never been applied before, or at least not to my knowledge. In Brexit, for example, it's really fascinating to be part of actually working on that in the UK government. But the example I'm going to mention very briefly is that on COVID. And I was thinking, everyone has had enough of COVID, but really it has been such a career-changing moment for me that I'd like to share very briefly why it was so fascinating for me to work on it. The first one was that as a behavioral scientist working on COVID, decisions were made faster than you could say, we need a new evidence review on this. It was so quick that we needed to find completely new ways of working and new methods and new ways of actually inserting ourselves in these decisions. And that has led to my team developing a framework to analyze behavioral risk. So if you make this decision, what could go wrong? What are all the different ways in which humans might behave if you're rolling out this intervention, if you're going into lockdown that might be unpredictable, and how can we mitigate those risks? So it really furthered the field in our approach. The second thing is that it gave me a huge appreciation of the breadth of behavioral science. For example, we worked with the London School of Economics on and their anthropology department on the question, what is a good death in COVID for different faith groups? Now, that is nothing that behavioral science, to my knowledge, has previously worked on, and I was mind blown and really humbled to understand how anthropologists work, thinking about from the moment your loved one gets picked up by the ambulance, to being in hospital, to actually dying, to having a funeral and so on, and what happens with the body, and what does this look like for different faith groups. Translating that into legislation has been so impactful and humbling for me personally. And then finally, I can't not mention just how much my life changed, I think, during the vaccine rollout, for reasons that are not what you might think. So, usually it's so rewarding for behavioral scientists when people listen to you and they take your evidence and go, yeah, let's do this. But actually, during the vaccine rollout, we had done so much groundwork that suddenly the entirety of government was thinking behaviorally. And that was so rewarding. User journey analysis, barrier analysis, understanding different groups, understanding the risks of, say, mandating a vaccine, kind of working in close collaboration with behavioral scientists, but also just taking this on themselves. I think COVID had meant for me that, behavioral science has done leaps and bounds in the UK government.
Thank you very much, Laura. Very interesting. Chiara, what is a highlight for you in terms of impact of the use of behavioral science in your career?
So I also had COVID because I think that it's, especially if you were working in government during the pandemic, very close to citizen services, that was kind of a very important moment for a lot of behavioral scientists around. But given that Laura already spoke about COVID, maybe I can change subject. One kind of very recent experiment that we ran in partnership with the OECD and the Canadian and French government. I would love to speak about that because I'm very excited about this. So we recently partnered with the Privy Council in Canada and the French government to try to reduce the number of people sharing fake news and misinformation online. So it was a great experience because we came together as behavioral scientists from different governments and from an international organization working together. And basically what we did is that we embedded an experiment in a longitudinal survey, so in a survey that was done every 3 to 4 weeks on a Canadian sample. And we managed to reduce intentions to share fake news by 21%. but just giving people prompts on digital media literacy tips. So things like, have you checked the source of information, or have you checked the formatting of this? So very simple interventions, but tested online and with multiple governments at the same time. And why I like that so much, because in my experience, it's the first experiment done on misinformation with multiple governments at the same time, co-designing the solution and testing the solution together. And I hope that this will be more and more the case. I think that one of the possible future of behavioral science is actually mega studies and cross-border experimentation. So that's why I liked it so much.
Yes, it's a huge challenge working on fake news. But have you turned this experimentation into more concrete and more spread actions to the entire population of the countries you just mentioned?
No, and I don't think it would be a good idea actually to roll out everything at the entire population. I don't think that scaling these to the entire Canadian sample would be wise. But this is actually something that informed policy response at the Canadian level and also at the international level. So regulators are there as they're thinking about how to deal with fake news. These results was very powerful because it's putting the kind of the focus not on the content itself of fake news, but on the people. So on the people who actually need to be more resilient to fake news. And just these little things that for these communities seems trivial. It's not that trivial for regulators in the European Commission or in other places. So I think that's still a powerful message.
Thank you, Chiara. And Faisal, how about you? Could you please share one or two examples of emblematic or key example of your work in during your career, please?
So one of the examples that I was going to say, but maybe I won't now, was also around COVID. But it was from a completely different perspective. It was the way that Laura was speaking about how the UK government was all thinking behaviourally. I think when I was previously in the OECD and we were dealing with COVID for the organisation itself, we also had to apply a lot of these kind of behavioural thinking into the response, looking at user journeys, looking at all kinds of different things, also looking at it in terms of your staff and their safety and their well-being, and particularly things around their re-entry into the office and all of those kind of things. So there were lots of things there, but that's more probably behavioural organisations, which I know you're going to be speaking about in another panel as well. So maybe I'll give another example, which is more what I'm doing right now, which is out in the field in Nigeria. And maybe this also touches upon some of the other issues that have been highlighted as well, which is around using behavioural insights in order to do that checking and in order to do that quality checking and check the expectations that people have when they want you to engage with them and when they want you to come and fix a problem or do an intervention, which is we're currently doing some work around at-risk children, particularly in rural areas inside Nigeria. And of course, when we were first at the Policy Innovation Centre, when we were first asked to come and do this, we were asked to come and do some kind of intervention that would help. Of course, when you start to look at the literature, there's lots of things out there around school dropouts and around how to increase intake into school from those kind of people. So of course, the immediate request was for us to come in and run an intervention on dropouts. And there's lots of fantastic work that's been done in the UK and in the United States in particular around this. But of course, our job in applying this inside public policy is to turn around and say no. And to first of all say, well, how do you know that this is the issue? What are the real issues? We need to find out. We need to understand the diagnostics. Anyway, fast forward after we've done some diagnostics in a number of different states, the issue doesn't seem to be dropout. The issue seems to be registration in the first instance, which leads to a completely different way of thinking about the problem. And I think that's one of the things I think Laura, you're mentioning as well, which is around that rethinking and re-understanding of for policymakers about how to address some of these complex issues, and not necessarily to jump to assumptions, but check and start to have more of an empirical and evidence-based way of even thinking about them. And of course, now we know that we have to deal with the problem in a completely different way. We've just done the diagnostics, by the way, so we're not now going to move on towards thinking about if there are interventions. But again, we might find that there isn't an easy intervention, because it may well be that there's a very conscious decision being made by parents who are in a particular scenario and situation to not register their children in the first instance. And therefore, we need to now carefully understand this issue and problem better. So I think, this is one of, one of the things, I think, probably pointing towards where behavioral science is now making great contributions towards public policy is in relation to those governments who are using this in not only just in an interventionist tool, but also in terms of a diagnostic tool as well.
Thank you, Faisal. There are so many questions I would like to ask you, but unfortunately, we are getting short on time. So let me just ask you maybe last one question. What do you think are the key challenges for the future of behavioral sciences in public policy? And I would like to start with you, Chiara, because when we discussed last week, you told me that it was the wrong question, and that the real question was more, how can we ensure that it continues to deliver value for public policy and in the public interest, right?
Yeah, thank you for Adelaide I must say I forgot what I told you last week, but I can start over. I hope it will be consistent with what I told you last week. But I see basically, I think, four main kind of big challenges for behavioral science going forward to keep having impact and delivering value. And I kind of organize these in a sort of an acronym, which is kind of SINS. So SINS as capital SINS, our SINS as behavioral scientists. So scaling, impatience, nudges, and systems. So let me just briefly talk to you about this. One of the big issues and challenges is something that we touched on already in this discussion, which is scaling. The fact is that there is a lot of evidence that has been generated and we're not using it. So even for the population of interest, some great results that governments had over these 15 years are still not implemented and scaled. So it seems like if you go back to the Trojan horse metaphor, it seems like we went through with a Trojan horse into government, but we're still waiting in the horse, waiting for really implementing evidence in so many different places. So that's a shame. So I think that's the first challenge. The second one is impatience, coming back to something that Laura was saying. It's about time. So there's a big mismatch between the time that we take in generating evidence on behavioral science and the pace of governments. During crisis, governments, they make decisions in minutes or hours. The policy cycle is about 2-3 hours. So I think that we need to be better at trade-offs. So sometimes, we're a little bit afraid of saying, oh, there's not enough evidence for this, or we didn't test in this specific context. So I did this mistake myself. Sometimes you just don't give any advice to governments, which is, what's the counterfactual? Basically, they're not using any existing evidence to base their decisions on, vaccinations or masks. So I think it's important to come up with meaningful trade-offs. The second thing is about kind of having better methods, and I think we're getting better at this, are generating experiments much more faster. And also I think we should get better at kind of accelerating learning within the community. And at the OECD, we're really trying to help with that, to share lessons learned very quickly, not waiting for the report to come up. The third challenge is nudges. You might say, why are you putting nudges as a challenge? I think that nudges is, we wouldn't be here without Nudge as a book, but I think we have been a little bit pigeonholed by the concept of nudging. So as Laura was saying, sometimes we are a little bit the comms team doing tweaks and changes to existing letters or things. And we know that behavioral science is much more than that. And I think that there's still this perceived dichotomy between separation between traditional policy on one side and nudging on the other, and this is absolutely detrimental. We know that traditional policy instruments, regulation, financial incentives, everything can be behaviorally informed. We know this very well. Policymakers often don't, or at least many of them still pigeonholed the behavioral science community within nudging. So I think the next generation of nudges, I hope, it will be better integrated in traditional policymaking tools. Last point is about systems. I'm sorry I couldn't be there for Michael's presentation before, but I guess he talked about systems as well. It's true that we are not great at looking at the bigger picture of what we do. The behavioral science community is really great at measuring local impacts, so changing misinformation, sharing in this context. We are not great at looking at bigger systems. So, and I think the other problem is that we're not great at generating kind of causal links across systems. So I think that in the future it will be great to have more theories and more overarching principles to really try and explain and predict behaviors. So this is something that we are not there yet, but hopefully the community together with academics will be able to move into that direction. This was pretty long, but I hope I put together some of these main 4 ideas. So scaling impatience, nudges or next generation of nudges, and systems, thinking more about systems and not only local impact.
Thank you, Chiara. It was very clear. Faisal, how about you? Would you agree with what, in a few words, would you agree with Chiara? And is there any other big challenge that you see, even if she was?
I think much of what Chiara said, I think I agree with that. And I think that what I would say also is that one of the biggest challenges before, and it increases now with the greater application and widespreadness of the behavioral sciences in public policy, is around managing expectations. That there has to be the continual effort to almost set out the stall in a particular way, and to ensure that those people that are requiring this, and often this is politicians, but also it is the public, it can also be journalists, whoever it is who is going to be scrutinizing the work that is happening, that the expectations are set right. Because very quickly, in certain places where behavioral science maybe didn't take off as much as it should have done, I can quite clearly see that it was the issue around setting the behavior, the expectations right of what is the contribution to behavioral science. So nobody in the behavioral science community says that behavioral science is going to fix everything. Nobody says that it's a silver bullet, but some people will take it and adopt it and think that it is going to solve all those things that they couldn't solve with anything else. And I think that those kind of expectations need to be set right. I think the other expectations that need to be set right as well is around the limitations of what can be done using a behavioral intervention. Sometimes, and this goes into some of the systems stuff that Chiara's talking about, but sometimes there isn't a behavioral intervention. Sometimes there is an intervention that might be very structural and might need changing. It may have behavioral elements to it, but it's something else. And I think having those conversations and fully understanding those things, I think, is very important from the beginning, which can be quite difficult, particularly if certain initiatives are just starting up. But it's important to get the stall set right from the beginning and continue that messaging all the way throughout to ensure that there aren't unrealistic expectations, or that people feel as though it didn't contribute as much as it should have done.
Thank you, Faisal. Laura, would you like to add something in a few words?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, but because I have three very different challenges, I'll talk about them in a couple of words. The first one for me is that I have been a long-standing proponent of kind of upstream behavioral science work. So, you have downstream is for me kind of the changing some communications and so on, and often actually testing them with RCT, so where you can test more with RCTs than comms, but kind of that downstream package. And upstream for me is much more around kind of really problem definition, diagnostics, strategies, and so on. And they are much harder to evidence. I think one of the impact of them is much harder to evidence. So I think actually demonstrating the value of this upstream work, where often we have no counterfactual, we are part of a team, and it's unclear what the world would look like if we weren't there. And we need to get better at telling these stories and not be distracted to only do downstream work because we can quantify and monetize our contribution. That's my first challenge. The second challenge for me is to not be boxed in by what we think behavioral science should do. So if you walk around a certain parts of government and you listen to the conversations that behavioral scientists have on the water cooler, you will hear them talk about what framework are you using for this? What framework have you used for this? Can we share the frameworks? And I think we often find problems and then we try to squeeze them into existing frameworks because that gives us some certainty. When for me, it's much more about take a problem, look at the shape, see what you can do with the brain of yours that is, really primed to think about behaviors and come up with something and do R&D on whatever you come up with. Develop a new framework, develop a new approach. Don't be boxed in of what you think you should be doing. And don't let yourself be boxed in either, to Faisal's point. And then my very last point is slightly rogue. But I think for me, one of the future of behavioral science in government is actually to change the unit of analysis from looking at citizens to looking at public policy makers and their behaviors. So most of us are experts in decision-making under uncertainty. Policymakers make a lot of decisions under uncertainty. A lot of us, and I might disagree with Chiara here slightly, are actually experts in systems thinking. In fact, I often recruit for systems thinking as a trait. Policymakers operate in very complex systems. So how about we look at what an ideal policy-making process would actually be like, taking account of the behaviors and decisions that people have to make to come to a point where better assumptions about human behavior are kind of baked in the process, rather than us kind of trying to squeeze it in at specific points and to try and, shoehorn something that sometimes is a little bit more complicated than that. So I'd really like to see this new focus of behavioral science on public policy processes and decisions, rather than just on citizen behavior going forward.
Thank you, Laura. We are going to open up the conversation to the audience. Do we have any question for our speakers? Yes? There's one here.
Yes, I don't know if my question is more addressed to Chiara or to Faisal, but it's about if I remember well, 5 years ago, there was the OECD was producing a report presenting more than 110 case study that has been conducted all over the world. Do you as OECD are updating this report or any kind of analysis or share of new case study coming from these last 5 years? Because it was very useful for the practitioners.
Chiara, you want to answer this?
Sure, and then Faisal jump in anytime. That report from 2015 was done by Faisal and his team, and it was a super important time for the entire community because it was like the first international report collecting so many case studies. And I think we all remember that with great, it was, for me at least, working in government was extremely useful. And what we're trying to do now, given that the pace of new case studies is so great, we have digitalized that. So there is an online repository with case studies that it's online on the OECD website, connected to behavioral insights units as well. So you can actually also put on a project and share with others. And you can also share projects before like finishing them before concluding them. So like to try to accelerate the learning. So everything is online, just have a look. I will share the link later.
Thank you. We have a very interesting question here, and I'm not sure we will have time to say everything about it because we have only 6 minutes left. So maybe just one of you or two of you can discuss it. We knew it would come during the conversation. The question is, have you ever come across any ethical challenges in the course of your work? So the ethical issue is very crucial. I don't know which one of you would like to say a few words on this. I don't know, Faisal, Laura. Okay.
I can start if you like. Yeah. So yes is the short answer. That ethical issues do come about, and I think there are two things, however, in public policy institutions in particular that maybe differentiate from private sector institutions, which is that many public policy institutions already have existing ethical frameworks for what you can and you can't do. So, the report that was just mentioned, when we looked into whether or not ethics was a big concern in most public institutions, it wasn't so much of an issue only because there was already such a high standard and ethical standards that needed to be adhered to, and because there was levels of accountability and transparency meant that it was easier to navigate in public policy institutions. Now, that doesn't mean to say that still ethical issues don't necessarily come about, but there are existing frameworks that end up being used. I think the other thing, again, I think this is a pat on the back of the behavioral science community, is that transparency was used very well, that reports were being done by units who were doing their work. Again, that ensured that ethical standards remain high, and others also instituted things like ethical boards or advisory boards in order to help. So various different things that happen, but yes, ethical issues do arise, but there are these means and I guess systems in place in order to address them, certainly in public institutions.
Laura, I see you nodding. You want to add something?
Yeah, just one thing I really agree with Faisal there in terms of kind of not the responsibility of ethics is in government actually largely not with behavioral scientists, it's with researchers who do the research frameworks, it's with policymakers and so on. But something that really fascinates me is that this question of ethics keeps popping up. And I actually wonder if it pops up because of a misconception of how behavioral science really works. Because I am always so certain if someone would have, gone with my team throughout the pandemic and observed every little piece of evidence that we've provided or piece of thinking that we've done, no one would think, oh, what's the ethical issue with that? Because it actually makes policy more user-centered. It actually takes account of people's barriers, actually takes account of their circumstances, actually understands them. It challenges policymakers when they think, oh, we can just do that to people. And actually, that's, I really think, is kind of maybe this fear that comes from, kind of having some nudges done upon you without you really realizing that. And also from how marketing works and their techniques where, there is actually part of it is what you would call, like strong persuasion or kind of manipulation. So I think the field has something to do to address the popping up of this question, to reassure that this is really not what we're about.
Thank you, Laura. And Chiara, do you agree with
Yes, very quickly. That's a juicy part of the discussion because I disagree with both Faisal and Laura on this one. I've seen examples in my life of governments not having any ethical standards at all, zero. I worked in academia and in government, and sometimes government was systematically worse than academia on these. But that's just for the research part, which is kind of, you need research, like ethical standards for the research part. And I also seen the opposite example where you have kind of very heavy ethical standards, but are not fit for purpose, like saying about biological hazard and ethical issues there. So I think when I came at the OECD, I thought, we have a lot of ethical principles around, a lot coming from philosophy and kind of very high level thinking. So we decided to build on some of the work that have been done already at the OECD and come up with very practical principles. So just in June, we published a guide for ethics, like to use behavioral science in an ethical way in public policy, really having principle, practices, and examples. And a checklist as well, which is not perfect, but it's at least a checklist to check the most important ethical pitfalls when you apply behavioral science to public policy. So I will share the link as well about this.
Thank you very much. I think it will be very interesting. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it. Thank you so much to the three of you for being here today in this very interesting discussion. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. I think that Eric and Ted will say just a few words. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Adelaide. And thanks to our speakers. Thanks, Chiara, Faisal, and Laura. Good to see you again. We are soon heading to a break. We learned yesterday how important breaks are, indeed. But we are going to put Adrien on the spot for a little bit. If I can get a microphone for Adrien. Okay. Adrien, take us through. We're seeing you, particularly during the roundtables, working fast and furious.
Yeah, it was definitely hard to keep up with all the amazing ideas that were being shared. So forgive me, I didn't capture everything, but maybe let me show you a few highlights and things that I found really fun and interesting to capture. So the first one is like there's crystal ball and trying to guess how people will behave without actually trying to get those empirical evidence to see how they will actually behave. Yeah, a box full of questions. Because, and this one, obviously.
Chiara's example of the Trojan horse.
Yeah, it was like candy for me. This visual metaphor is so obvious. Waiting in the Trojan horse, waiting for implementation. And yeah, maybe this one to finish. Quick and easy and quick and cheap solution to solve complex problem, probably not the right way to perceive knowledge and behavioral science. Yeah, that's it for me.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit,
Sure.
Adrien. This concept of kind of sketch notes and illustrating for very complex topics. You have Adelaide, you have three speakers throughout the day. Not just about your process, but how do you think for our viewers who are here live, they're going to be able to receive these, people who are attending digitally, what's the use of having a sketch note? Talk us through a little bit. I have a point of view from a behavioral science point of view, but as an artist, tell us what you think.
Well, I could talk about that for hours, so let me just give you maybe a quick summary. First, I think it's a really good way to engage the audience during the talk. You have this way of grasping ideas and see how they can visually translate, so you are able to better remember them. And I think after the event, it's also a good way to obviously remember what was being said, but also to have meaningful conversation about topics that were discussed with original and maybe slightly different support for the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Do you know okay, yeah. And I mean, I think we have a feeling from a behavioral science point of view that we know that we capture information and learn things differently visually than we do just auditory. Some of our audience here has been sitting here on day 2. There's a lot of sessions, there's a lot to take in. So definitely around recall, but also kind of salience and bringing some of those ideas and helping crystallize the kind of keynotes or the kind of headlines in a visual way. So I think we got to give Adrien a break. It's time for lunch. But if you want access to those sketch notes, make sure you are joining the Human Advantage community online. You heard Stefan talk about it earlier. We do also want to measure your emotion. We know emotion is a precursor to certain behaviors, so do fill in that one question survey after each session. It's so easy to do. And we will see you back in an hour. So that will be at 2 p.m. here in Paris and Milan, at 1 p.m. in London. And by that point, we will be waking up our colleagues, at least in New York, if not in the rest of Americas. And we'll start that session on pharma and healthcare. So we will see you in 1 hour. Thanks so much. See you soon.